after this. So Brad holds a PhD in history from the University of Ottawa. His dissertation examined the Battle of Hong Kong and its legacy in Canada. He's the creator of the On This Day in Military History accounts on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And through these accounts, he profiles events of Canada's military past every day of the year. He also runs a YouTube channel of the same name where he creates videos about Canadian military history. And we'll share a link to Brad's channel and once we get going here, and I encourage people to visit his channel, explore that, and most importantly, be sure to subscribe. That's a big thing in the world of YouTube. Brad's also published several articles in a wide variety of topics connected to military history and Canadian history. He has worked as a researcher at the Canadian War Museum and with the Canadian Research and Mapping Association on several articles for Project 44. So please join me in welcoming Brad to deliver this afternoon's talk. Take it away, Brad.
Thanks, Tom. So just let me get set up here. So I want to begin saying thanks to History Symposium, Tom and Chris for having me on. It's really a great honor to be part of this series and all the other great names and a lot of people that I admire and some new people that I've learned about because of it. So it's a really great thing to be on here. So today, as has already been said, I'll be talking about the Battle of Hong Kong, but I'm going to be talking about more of its memory. But of course, as we were making a joke, historians got to set up the context. So that's going to be part of this as well. So the Battle of Hong Kong is often remembered in Canada for its negative aspects. This includes the supposed mistake of reinforcing the colony, the suffering that the troops endured as prisoners of war, and the mistreatment of Hong Kong veterans by the Canadian government in the post-war years. This trend, in combination with other actions, gives an overall negative impression of the battle in Canada. I'm not arguing that some of this negative attention is not merited, but there is much more that we can take from Canada's participation in the Battle of Hong Kong. Today, I will be talking about how some of the negative perceptions came to dominate the narrative. But first, as I said, I'll give some background information. So this question I get a lot, and you're probably thinking this right now: why were Canadian troops sent to a faraway British colony in Southeast Asia when the war in Europe was in full swing? So the most immediate cause for Canadians being sent to Hong Kong was a series of meetings, it's a little unclear, between British Brigadier General Arthur Edward Grandset, the commanding officer of Hong Kong from 1938 to 1941, and the talks he had with General Harry Croix, the Chief of General Staff of the Canadian Army, and the Canadian Defense Minister J.L. Ralston in Ottawa at some point in late summer 1941. So Grandset was Canadian by birth and was a graduate of the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. He was returning to Britain through Canada as his tenure as the commander at Hong Kong ended. Him and Croix were classmates at RMC, and they had corresponded a little bit prior to this time of the summer of 1941. So a meeting between those two is not out of the ordinary, particularly for his route back to Britain. So what's discussed at these meetings or meeting is very unclear. Again, as I keep saying meeting or meetings, it's not entirely sure how many there actually were. It depends on whose sources you're looking at. But one thing that is important and is key here is that all three of these men deny over years discussing that Canadian troops could be sent to Hong Kong as reinforcements. But given the series of events that followed their discussions, these claims are highly suspect. So there's Grandset there. So upon reaching Britain in very early September 1941, Grandset met with the British Chiefs of Staff and suggested outright that Canadian troops could reinforce Hong Kong. On September 19th, 1941, the Dominion's office in Whitehall in London cabled Ottawa, asking if Canada could provide troops to reinforce Hong Kong. Shortly after receiving the request, and with little debate, the Canadian War Cabinet Committee accepted the request and began a search to select which units to send. Croix, after consulting numerous officials, again, I'm still not entirely sure how many, in the Department of Defense, selected the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada to form the core of the Canadian force sent to Hong Kong, which was known by the name of Sea Force. They arrived in Hong Kong in late 1941, which gave them very little chance to acclimatize to their new post. So the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor begins on December 8th, 1941, just a few hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the plan of the defense was to stall the Japanese in the area of the colony known as the New Territories, the portion of the colony on the mainland that bordered China. You can see that here. So the Japanese moved quickly toward the colony's main defense position, which was known as the Gin Drinkers Line, which is a bit of an odd and an unfortunate name, which has to do with the bay that anchors the line itself, having to do with the supposed launching of pleasure cruises for British expats and colonial and officials in the colony for many years. So the Stingmon Redoubt was the central pivot of the Gin Drinkers Line, which you can see labeled on there as well. But after a very well-planned and well-executed Japanese attack, the redoubt fell on December 9th. And this action rendered the entire line untenable, forcing the defenders to abandon it. On the 11th, a general retreat from the mainland was ordered. Once all the troops were on Hong Kong Island, the garrison was split into 2 brigades. The West Brigade was commanded by the commander of the Canadian Forces, Brigadier J.K. Lawson, and the East Brigade was under British Brigadier Cedric Wallace. The Japanese bombed and shelled the islands for days until making the short crossing from the mainland on the 18th. The fighting on the island lasted until Christmas Day, 1941. So the Wang-Nechong Gap in the central part of the island saw some of the most intense and fierce fighting that the Canadians saw during the battle. The gap sat and still does sit at the confluence of several roads, important roads that stretch across the island, making it a key area and a key target for Japanese forces. In addition, it was the location of the West Brigade headquarters. On the 19th, Lawson told his commander, British General, C.M. Maltby, that the Japanese troops had surrounded his command post in the gap. And his last words to Maltby were, he's going outside to fight it out. Lawson's body was later found among the Japanese and Canadian dead that surrounded the command post. He was buried with full military honors by the Japanese. But the brunt of the Japanese attack at the gap fell on D Company, again, as you can see on the map, of the Winnipeg Grenadiers. 50 troops held on inside the buildings across the main road from the West Brigade headquarters. Luckily, the position was well stocked with machine guns and ammunition. The defenders took a heavy toll on the Japanese. By the evening of the 20th, the ammunition was running low and fatigue was setting in. And by the next day, all water sources had run dry. On the morning of the 22nd, the Japanese brought up a large gun and were firing point blank range at the door of the shelter, opening it. By this point, again, all the ammunition was gone and there was only 12 unwounded men remaining. By the time D Company had surrendered, at least 37 wounded were inside one of the buildings. While the walking wounded were taken prisoner, the Japanese reportedly murdered all other wounded men. So you can see here, this is Lawson and, this is Maltby and Lawson in the photo here, meeting just before the battle began. And here you can see where the fighting took place, a upper close picture labeling all the different elements that happened. So one attack in particular is of interest to me and has been for quite some time. This is the Christmas Day attack on Stanley Village by D Company of the Royal Rifles. So the attack was ordered by Wallace to push the Japanese out of the village. It was one of the best executed assaults by the Canadians during the battle, but also the most futile. Throughout the battle, counterattacks were necessary to defend the garrison's positions, particularly when the Japanese had taken the high ground. But by the 25th, the tactful usefulness of such attacks had been outstripped by the collapse of the strategic situation. So Sergeant George MacDonnell of the Royal Rifles was tasked with leading his platoon's attack, thinking that, and I quote, "the sheer stupidity of the order to send us without artillery, mortar, or machine gun support into a village full of Japanese in broad daylight was not lost on me." Japanese heavily outnumbered D Company, perhaps as many as 10 to 1. Again, the numbers are unclear. The promised artillery and fire support never materialized. And as you can see, number 16 platoon advanced on the right side along the coast, while platoons 17 and 18 attacked on the left. The attack began at about 1:30 from the Stanley prison. Attacking on the right flank, Rifleman Raymond Elliott of 16 platoon recorded in his diary that fighting everywhere, bullets coming like hail, and some other very vivid details of the wounded falling around him. Attacking on the left flank, Macdonell's platoon charged through the graveyard. Again, you can see there on the map, with bayonets fixed, forcing the Japanese to fall back. Upon entering the village, the Canadians poured fire into the Japanese troops advancing towards them. As the Japanese began to reorganize, they started inflicting Canadian casualties. This forced the Canadians to take up positions in and around the line of houses that they had cleared to prepare for defenses. Again, as you can see here, marked by A, B, and C, the bungalows there. So a lull ensued while the Japanese were starting to regroup for their counterattack. The men of D Company were running out of ammunition and water and had suffered many casualties in the bungalows by this point. I spoke with George Macdonell recently, and he stressed to me the importance of water during an attack, particularly in the climate of Hong Kong. And he wanted me to make sure others knew so. The lull was short-lived as the Japanese attacked after 20 minutes. With the Japanese outflanking their positions and about to encircle them, they received an order to pull back to the prison. The men went back in small parties, but non-mobile wounded had to be left behind. The company lost 26 killed and 25 wounded. So these are just two examples with both D companies of both battalions of the Canadians' fighting ability, which has been much maligned in the years since the battle. Overall, the Canadians lost 290 men killed in the fighting, but the battle did not see the end of dying of troops from Seaforth. After the garrison surrendered on Christmas Day, 1941, the Canadians were subject to nearly 4 years of brutal conditions of the Japanese prisoner of war camps and working as slave labor. This period is one of the darkest for Canadians in the Second World War. The troops were initially placed in POW camps, either at North Point Camp on the island or at Sham Shui Po in Kowloon on the mainland, with the latter eventually housing most of the Canadians. Conditions quickly deteriorated as the camps were extremely overpopulated. Japanese negligence led to many prisoner deaths from diphtheria, dysentery, typhoid fever, malnutrition. The Japanese also took Canadian lives, including the execution of 4 soldiers after a failed escape attempt in August 1942. Some of the worst punishment doled out to the Canadian POWs was by Kano Inouye, a Canadian who was serving in the Japanese Imperial Army. He was born in Kamloops, British Columbia, and had been subjected to racist treatment during almost his entire childhood. He was nicknamed the Kamloops Kid by the Canadians, as well as Slap Happy by more of the, say, British and Hong Kong POWs, due to his proclivity to beat the prisoners. He was eventually executed for treason by the Canadian government after the war. Starting in 1943, Canadians were sent in drafts, multiple, to Japan to work as slave laborers in mines, factories, ports, and rail yards. More lives were lost to dangerous work conditions and the poor treatment again received from the Japanese. One again outstanding event is a deliberate act of sabotage that some Canadians carried out. What they did is they burned all of the blueprints at the Yokohama shipyard near Tokyo. Again, as this is the time before digital backups, destroying all the blueprints effectively shut down the shipyard for an extended period of time. And acts of this kind of sabotage, but not to this level, were actually quite common amongst the POWs. And again, as George Macdonell spoke to me, he wanted me to ensure that people knew they kept fighting, even as POWs. So the POWs, again, spent many years as in prison camps and in these different conditions. But again, were finally started to be liberated in September 1945, after the Japanese surrendered to the Allied powers after the atomic bombings. So is there any questions for me at this point that anyone has raised?
Thanks, Brad. So I'm just going to remind everybody that there is, again, a lag between sort of what we're presenting and what's appearing on Zoom, and it seems to be particularly long today. So I'm going to actually turn to Tom for a second. He said that he had a couple of questions, and then we'll see if any pop up on the Zoom, on the YouTube channel while he's asking.
So Brad, the Royal Rifles of Canada, what was their home base back in Canada?
Quebec City.
Quebec City? Okay. So you had Quebec City and then Winnipeg were the the regiments represented. And then what was the total number of Allied forces defending Hong Kong?
The total garrison, which included literally just under 2,000 Canadians. Again, the numbers vary because of the different units, but around 10,000 is the estimates I've seen. Again, because there is a local defense force, which again, the numbers were a bit sketchy at the time.
All right, and then what countries contributed to the defense of Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's 2 British regiments that contributed to the defense that were there for many years prior to the war. The Middlesex Regiment, which provided all the heavy machine guns used particularly in the bunkers on the island. And then the 2nd Royal Scots were the troops at the gin drinkers line. And then you have 2 British Indian Army, excuse me, units. The Rajputs, a battalion of the Rajputs and a battalion of the Punjabis, excuse me. Also, and also there was a smattering of artillery units, not very many. There was an RAF contingent, just literally a handful of aviators, only a few planes that were instantly destroyed once the attack began. And then, like I said, you have the local defense forces. These had been men born in the colony, expats, who wanted to defend the colony and had been training. Some of them had been training for years. Some had just joined just before the war started. So again, you have a whole spectrum of experience and backgrounds for these troops fighting in this battle.
All right, and then the attacking Japanese forces, do we have a sense for how large they were?
Big. So you have 3, so it's the 38th Division. And the Japanese army is, at this point, is organized a little differently than, say, the Commonwealth armies were. They have 3 regiments. So those are larger organizations that have battalions, 3 battalions attached to them, roughly about the same number as a Commonwealth battalion. So just around, well, again, it depends, but less than 1,000 men, usually around 800 or so. So the Japanese are around there as well. So those are 3 of those plus numerous artillery units, very much outnumbering the garrison artillery units. They had attachments of engineers, and again, they controlled the sea basically. Again, there was a small Royal Navy attachment that makes a little bit of punching above their weight, but not much more than that because the ship just runs aground. And then also the Japanese have, like I said, air control, and they're bombing the island basically at will. But one thing I will say, and I see this I saw the numerous diaries and recollections, the troops were not too worried about the bombing. They said it was more of a psychological thing, especially the bomb's damage was minimal at best, but the artillery is what caused the most consternation and damage and casualties.
All right, so estimate the total numbers of Japanese?
Oh, sorry, the Japanese. Yeah, around 30,000.
Okay, so almost 3 to 1.
Almost. Yeah, again, the numbers are a bit sketchy.
All right, and then you kind of skimmed by it quick, and some of it I might have been a little distracted monitoring everything going on here. Like, so there's 2 phases, kind of like the mainland kickoff,
Yeah.
and then the leapfrog to the island. Like the first phase, like with the gin drinkers line, and that, like was that heavy fighting, or did they roll over pretty quickly, or?
No. So again, yeah, I wasn't sure how to best present this because it is 2 phases, and the fighting on the island is the majority of the fighting. The fight for the gin drinkers line was not a heavy fight by any means, and not because of the lack of will or determination from the Royal Scots by any means. They were just outclassed and outmaneuvered literally at the redoubt, and the Japanese just closed very quickly, and they were able to clear out the position very fast. And once you have a major hole within a defensive line, like the gin drinkers line, it's untenable because then you can be attacked from the rear. So this was realized quite quickly, and the retreat was ordered back to the line to set up lines around Kowloon. But again, that ended very, very quickly. Hardly any combat at that point. And then the retreat is ordered, like I said, on the 11th.
All right, and then maybe a last one from me, but my sense is that it was particularly difficult and vicious fighting on the island. Is some of that the topography, like the island's quite mountainous and rugged?
Yeah, so the conditions, yeah, I can speak to the conditions. The conditions of the island are difficult. And as I've come to understand it, this in December 1941, the weather is kind of all over the place. It can be hot, but it can also be very cool and wet. And these, like you said, and you can see on the map, it's quite mountainous, and there's numerous high peaks. Most of those were fought over, as you can see the arrows moving, and why the gap that I spoke about is so important. So the topography obviously plays a role. The skill and determination of the Japanese troops plays a major role in the ferocity of the fighting. There's all kinds of accounts where the Japanese just keep attacking when they probably shouldn't. They're taking high numbers of casualties, particularly from those heavy machine guns that I mentioned that were used by the Middlesex, but also various other units. But also their experience fighting in China plays a role with the infiltration that they've learned, and particularly night fighting plays an important role in basically allowing these positions to be taken over and over again. And the Japanese can pour in reinforcements, whereas the garrison cannot.
All right, and then maybe I lied. I got another question. So then by the time you're talking about the Canadians in the area of the Stanley jail,
Yeah.
like it doesn't really show on the map, but that's pretty much you're running out of Hong Kong Island at that point, right? That literally
Yeah.
their backs are to the proverbial wall.
More or less. I mean, as you can see the lines here. It's all the way at the bottom. Yeah, that's why I included the other map. But yeah, the line here is where the attack comes out of at the bottom. But yeah, they basically literally had been pushed to the back. There's more room on the west side of the island, and there was plans to keep falling back and set up a line outside there, as you can see, Victoria. But the situation had been so bad at this point, water, and you can see some of the reservoirs, those had all been taken. So the water was running out, ammunition was running low. So the governor and Maltby, the commander, decide to surrender the entire garrison in the afternoon on the 25th.
All right, thanks. I don't think there's any other questions. I sort of dominated that break. So if you want to carry on, then we'll remind people, throw them in the chat, and then we'll bring your question forward to Brad. He's got a little talk on the aftermath of Hong Kong and remembering people's service there, and then we'll have a chance for a little bit more Q&A. So
sounds good. So yeah, as Tom just said, sorry, excuse me, I'll be moving into the post-battle, best way to call it, the post-battle events, some which are very well known, some which are not at all, that have an impact on how the memory of the battle is developed in Canada, and some that are quite old that still kind of resonate in ways that a lot of people would not expect. So the first one is what I've shortened to. It has a much longer official name, but the 1942 Hong Kong Inquiry. So the fall of the colony created a lot of political backlash in Canada. And as you can see here, again, a very interesting character, not getting into it today, but you can see the picture of his mother hanging over him there. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and his government faced a lot of criticism about Hong Kong, particularly from the opposition conservatives in Parliament. And again, the recordings in the House of Commons make this quite clear. But with that said, no one was as tough on King and his government than George Drew. So this is George Drew here. He was an Ontario politician and member of the Ontario Parliament at the time of the fall of the colony and then into the inquiry, but also a veteran of the First World War, and quite well known throughout Canada because of that and his pre-war writings, his interwar writings about the First World War, but also, with storm clouds of war gathering in the late 1930s, he writes quite a bit about that as well. So King and Drew, and this is putting it extremely mildly, had been at odds with each other for years and years over all kinds of issues. All things of claims of communism within unions to the Bren Gun inquiry, if you've heard of that, about supposed corruption and awarding contracts for the manufacturing of military equipment. And their mutual dislike is extremely clear from their diaries and writings, and even to each other. And there's quite a few of the letters to each other that are available in the archives. But the Battle of Hong Kong just adds another chapter to this really feud that lasts years. So in early 1942, I'm talking very early 1942, like the first week of January, there's talk about doing an official investigation. King is initially against it because he doesn't really want to bring any more attention to it. But the opposition is so strong that he does. And he does this rather, I think, naively, expecting that if we bring the documents to light or the events to light, the attacks will end. Again, that is not what happens. So what they do is they organize the inquiry under Lyman Duff. And he is the Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court at the time. They chose him for his high profile and his supposed impartiality, which I argue is not true because he was a very open public member of the Liberal Party for most of his life. Also, interestingly enough, George Drew is appointed as the Inquiry Opposition Counsel for the proceedings. So the proceedings took place in the spring of 1942. Numerous witnesses are questioned, everyone from General Andrew McNaughton, the lead of the First Canadian Army in Britain, is questioned about this. Also, the people who loaded the ships in Vancouver that carried the troops across are also questioned. And there's lots of details. And again, I hope to do a little bit more on the inquiry moving forward in the future. But again, there's hundreds of exhibits entered into the evidence. I read them all. There's a lot. So this was done so that Duff could make his report. And this, I argue, the first inquiry is the first major influence on the battle's legacy. As many, including Drew, and the aftermath of it, used the inquiry to portray the battle as overtly negative in an attempt to discredit King and his governments. So the commission hearings were held in camera, or what is in private, and therefore the Canadian public did not know about the details until many years later. So the aftermath of the inquiry had far more of an impact on how Hong Kong was viewed than the actual inquiry itself. So Duff's report was delivered publicly on June 4th, 1942. It had two parts, the report itself and an appendix expanding upon the commission's findings, which, yes, it does. And it is weird that there are these two parts that are nearly identical and very quite confusing as well. And Duff looks at a lot of the numerous issues and a lot of the issues that still exist in the historiography today. So in regard to whether Canada should have accepted Britain's 1941 request for troops, Duff absolved the government of any wrongdoing. And again, I'm quoting from the report here. It would perhaps be a possible view that the propriety of this decision by the government is exclusively a matter for the consideration and discussion by Parliament. Since, however, I am required to pass upon the question, it is my duty to say that I have no doubt that the course taken by the government was the only course open to them in the circumstances. So he's trying to pass it off even while he's issuing a report and notes he can't. So Duff concludes, the evidence satisfies me that General Criar's recommendation was made upon sound grounds and that he is not chargeable with any error in judgment, still less with any dereliction of duty in relation to it. Duff also exonerated Criar about the selection of the Royal Rifles and the Grenadiers. I do think, apart from all the issues with the inquiry, Duff made a few important points about the decision to reinforce the colony and that the ones that stand the test of time and hindsight. He argues that the maintenance of peace, although it failed, was worth seeking. And he wrote, but these events of December cannot, of course, invalidate the grounds of the decision of the Canadian government in September to accept a share of the responsibility for strengthening the garrisons of the Pacific. And Duff offered a conclusion that still holds true today. Statesmen and soldiers can properly be held accountable for a reasonably capable practical judgment as such probabilities, but not on the assumption that they must have interior knowledge of subsequent events. So you can't blame them for things they do not know. To put it again mildly, Drew disagrees with Duff's findings because Drew is part of the inquiry the entire time. He's seeing the proceedings, he's seen all the exhibits and was there for every witness being questioned. Drew makes his opinions very publicly known on more than one occasion. One such incident led to King's government actually charging George Drew on July 3rd, 1942, for unlawfully making, and I quote, a statement or reference with respect to the report of the Crown Colony of Hong Kong likely to prejudice the recruiting of His Majesty's forces contrary to the Defense of Canada regulations. So this comes from an assertion that, Drew made on June 5th, 1942, that Duff had ignored evidence and reached these conclusions without said evidence. Drew also claimed that the proceedings were being held in secret so that Duff could reach the conclusions desired by the King's government, by a King's government. The charges were dropped shortly after, but the damage to the Battle of Hong Kong's legacy was done, as the negativity surrounding George Drew, who I said was quite a popular man, and the charges laid against him had created. So the release of the Duff Report and Drew's charges have become entangled with the Battle of Hong Kong and how Canadians perceive it. The Canadian media at the time, and like I said, the aftermath was far more impactful than the actual inquiry itself in the Canadian public. The Canadian media reacted strongly to both events of the release of the Duff Report and Drew's charges. The Montreal Gazette ran several editorials following the release of the Duff Report. The editor sang the praises of George Drew on June 6th, calling him a man outstanding in Canadian public life. Another Gazette article that day argued that the responsibility of the Duff Commission was either to assign blame for the botch or to explain what circumstances created the misleading impression. Sir Lyman's report does neither. It simply asserts, "I am satisfied," that no fault was committed by anyone. Canadian confidence in the good judgment of our Chief Justice is or was very high, but was never as high as all that. The Winnipeg Tribune called out the government, called for the government to give the Canadian people assurance that such mistakes had been learned and that they would never happen again, and used, again, the information learned and lessons to better the Canadian Army. The Globe and Mail out of Toronto hyperbolically stated, after the people rose in their wrath, it was announced that the prosecution of Drew was withdrawn so the Parliament could debate Hong Kong. Not a lot of wrath at the time, especially given the limited amount of time between the charges and their withdrawal. The paper claimed that if King kept the facts of Hong Kong secret, it is the final step in the death of freedom in Canada. Again, this is being said in 1942. The inquiry, the charges against Drew, and the media reactions were the first exposures of the Battle of Hong Kong beyond the initial reports of the fighting to much of the Canadian public. So another area that is getting more attention, particularly recently, is the treatment of the veterans by the Canadian government. So another area that contributes to this negative perception is the poor treatment of the Hong Kong veterans by the Canadian government in the post-war years. Once the Second World War ended, members of C-Force faced many challenges back in Canada. Hong Kong veteran Kenneth Cambon, and one of the youngest members of C-Force, wrote, "It is difficult for me to write about my return home and the first few years in Canada. Strange that it should be that way, now that more than 45 years have passed. In some ways, they were harder on me than the years in the prison camp. There, the only goal was to survive." William Allister, Canadian artist, and veteran of Hong Kong, described the difficulty that he faced when trying to reintegrate with his family. "The more I strove to become part of this setting, the more it eluded me. Along with this awareness came an unidentified anxiety that gnawed at me, as if though some furry tarantula had slipped into my brain and was creeping about with soft, threatening steps. This was to be the hallmark of former POWs in the years ahead." So many returning veterans subsequently suffered from alcoholism, psychological issues, and general poor health. And as I've noted there, that many veterans had difficulty reintegrating back into civilian life. Many veterans of C-Force employed alcohol as a coping mechanism. Andrew Flanagan, whose work as his diary has just been recently published by his son, used alcohol to get to sleep pretty much every night after returning from the POW camps. He recalled that beer helped him sleep, but the whiskey made him fightable. So he needed beer to cope, and whiskey did him too much and made him angry. But with that said, not all veterans had much difficulty readjusting in the long term. Cambon, who became a doctor actually in the years post battle and imprisonment, was astonished that the government would pay for his university and give him a monthly stipend. He believed that the Canadian government did more for its veterans than any other belligerent country. Alistair has a more negative experience of this period. Again, he wrote in his biography, or sorry, his memoir of the battle and his years as a POW, wrote, "There was no counseling, no advice, no awareness that we might act or feel any differently. It was sink or swim. You're on your own, boys. Like good Canadians, we expected nothing, got nothing. We were paid off in a lump sum. 4 years back pay shoved it in the pocket of my battle dress. Then 5 days that landed me on the train home, stomach inflamed, fingers trembling, nerves shot." Historian Charles Rowland, in his book about the Hong Kong prisoners of war and focuses on their health, noted that by 1949, it had become apparent that the rehabilitation of these former prisoners of the Japanese had not proceeded as well as been hoped or expected. So financial compensation, was also lacking for the veterans. In 1951, the Allied powers and Japan signed a peace treaty that officially ended the war in the Pacific. One provision provided the Hong Kong POWs with a payment of $1,995, or $1.50 for every day of incarceration by Japan as compensation for their hardship. An important distinction, particularly for the former POWs, was that this payment did not come from Japan itself, but from seized Japanese assets in Canada. As veteran Roger Sear had stated, "I feel that the day I was captured by the Japanese, that my personal rights were hacked to death. I became a non-person. I was treated worse than a dog. I further believe that when time came for the Allied powers to settle with Japan, and when they eventually did negotiate a peace treaty, and when they did sign the peace protocol in 1952, my rights were totally ignored." So moving into the post-war years, the Department of Veterans Affairs was ill-prepared to provide proper rehabilitation. Further, the issue of mental health was brushed aside to focus on physical ailments. In a March 28, 1951 letter to senior treatment medical officers of the department, Director of General Treatment Services, W.P. Warren, wrote, "While it is true and quite understandably true that besides the existence of probably organic lesions of the central nervous system, there is an emotional factor present in many of these veterans. This should not be the focal point for investigation, counseling, and treatment. It should be understand that probably veterans who suffered from years of diets marked deficient in vitamins have an organic lesion. It is felt that while the veteran is hospital under investigation, that aspect of his under investigation and treatment should be stressed, rather than immediately putting him on a neuropsychiatric service." So in the years following all of this, there was many studies done on the veterans' health to see how much their time as POWs had affected their mental and physical health. Again, to establish if they needed more compensation to receive from the Canadian government. In December 1963, the Canadian House of Commons Committee on Veterans Affairs recommended undertaking a special study on these veterans. Dr. H.J. Richardson examined the files of 100 ex-POWs. Only 5% of these veterans claimed to have suffered no disability whatsoever from their POW experience, but the rest continued to suffer in some way. Notable was the high number of deaths attributed to heart disease, and that 95% of surveyed veterans receiving a pension for vitamin deficiency. Richardson recommended that dental coverage be given to all Hong Kong veterans holding pensions for this condition, but suggested that was actually implemented in May 1965. Richardson also suggested that the commission review old rulings found that death by heart disease was not caused by service, as there was likely connection between heart disease and their service and imprisonment, which went pretty much nowhere. As a result of the lack of proper treatment from the government, the Hong Kong veterans came together to form an association. The Hong Kong Veterans Association, or the HKVA, was born in 1965. The organization claimed that the disability formula pension formula did not support them. They decried medical professionals for ignoring their unique illnesses that developed due to the vitamin deficiencies, but also some tropical diseases. Most importantly, the veterans came together given the difficulties they faced as individuals obtaining benefits from the government. Regional groups formed first, but eventually these groups combined to create a national organization. The aims and objectives of the association were to, and and I quote, to assist all members in the time of need to maintain and improve social welfare and friendship among members and their dependents, to promote legislation for the physical well-being of all members of Sea Force or allied personnel who were imprisoned by Japan 1941-1945. In a June 19, 1970 editorial in the Edmonton Journal, Stanley Batty charged, again a veteran, in prison camp, our captors were patiently waiting for our demise. Here at home, some 25 years later, it would appear as though our own government is playing the same waiting game. So such attitudes demonstrate the important role that the HKVA played. Beginning in 1985, the War Amputations of Canada and the HKVA undertook a general study of sea veterans' health in order to put a claim before the United Nations to hold Japan monetarily responsible for its wartime actions. Dr. Gustav Gingras reviewed the files of over 400 veterans in order to obtain compensation or their widows for their slave labor. Gingras listed a number of disorders, including gastrointestinal, foot, oral, visual, spinal, cardiovascular, respiratory, and neurogenital issues. Vitamin deficiency, psychiatric issues, neurological impairment, and social problems were prominently noted. Gingras concluded, it is strongly believed that the suffering ex-POWs are fragile persons and more prone to suffer from a variety of physical, psychiatric, and social disorders than the so-called normal members of the general population. The physical effects of their incarceration were apparent to many veterans. Leo Sear said that 4 years of war in captivity took 10 years off his life. Walter Gray had to retire from his job at the post office at 51 due to poor health. As for mental health, many veterans were unsure of the effects, if any, combat imprisonment had on their mental state. When asked if his service and imprisonment had any effects on his physical and mental health, Frank Harding stated, physically, yes. Mentally, I would certainly say it has affected my relationship with my family. Maybe I am different. I don't know. John Simcoe answered, yes, I may appear calm, but I never am. I've been that way ever since. I have a great deal of apprehension and anxiety. I am faced with stress. I become very tense. I'm not what I should be. The veterans were also asked if they thought their fellow ex-POWs were aging faster than the average veteran of World War II. Joseph Gursky pointedly responded, not only do they age fast, they are dying sooner. So the claim to the UN was submitted in 1987. As per the payments made in 1952, the Canadian and Japanese government considered the matter closed. As such, the veterans received no Canadian government support for their claim. In 1991, the UN committee found that the veterans had not exhausted their domestic options to pursue further compensation. Also, there was no way to force Japan to pay. In 1993, the veterans pushed the Canadian government to provide the compensation if Japan would not. 5 years later, the government finally compensated the surviving veterans and 400 widows with $24,000 each. The veterans again were upset that the money came from Canadian taxpayers instead of the Japanese government. Finally, in 2001, the remaining veterans were told they would finally receive 100% pension coverage. But this was far too late considering many of the veterans had already died. On December 8th, 2011, Japan finally issued an apology to the Hong Kong veterans. In a letter from Japan's ambassador to Canada, Akaro Ishikawa, after the Japanese people should bear in mind that we must learn from the lesson of history, regard the facts of history as they are. He added, I would like to state a heartfelt apology for our country having caused tremendous damage and pain to Canadian former POWs who have undergone tragic experiences in camps in both Hong Kong and Japan. But no monetary compensation came with this act of contrition. So another major outlet of experience and on the Canadian memory of the battle is the Valor and the Horror. So this was a docudrama series created by journalists and brothers Terrence and Brian McKenna in the 1990s. There's 3 episodes. Hong Kong was the first. There was one on Bomber Command, and then the Battle of Normandy. The Battle of Hong Kong episode was first, covered Sea Force's experience. So this episode presented the Canadian reinforcement as a conspiracy, which it was not, between the British and Canadian governments to send Canadian troops into harm's way. The filmmakers claim that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, unwilling to risk British lives, tricked the Canadian government into providing troops. The filmmakers also claim that the details of what happened to these soldiers were for a long time suppressed by the Canadian government. Such a claim is completely false by all of the evidence I presented here. And again, the official histories had been released for decades at this point. The federal government did try to downplay the events, but as you've seen, these failed and actually just brought more attention to the events of Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong episode was the least controversial of the series, as the producers didn't criticize C-Force and the men who fought in it, and they presented their years in Japanese captivity sympathetically, which was lacking from the other two episodes. Despite this lack of attention, the episode is just as problematic. The coverage of the fighting included numerous mistakes and took so many creative liberties using actor portrayals. Things like units in the wrong place is very common. People who had no way of possible being where that the filmmakers claimed are also made. So one in particular is when they use an actor to portray Sergeant John Payne, who's told by a supposed British officer that the Japanese couldn't possibly have been landing on the island. So he was denied any artillery support that would have been available, as they call by an arrogant British officer. So the actor says, who portrays Payne, says, "We're commanded by these British imperial types. Some of them just don't trust us colonials." He actually told me I must be dreaming. So event like this did occur, but it was not Payne. He was nowhere near the Japanese landing. He was in the Grenadiers on the west side of the island. Also, he had been killed in 1942. So there is no way that the filmmakers were able to find any such writing about this or speak to him directly like they did with other veterans. Another really troubling part for me in this episode is the portrayal of nursing sister Kay Christie, one of the two that went with C-Force. She's shown with tears welling in her eyes, stating that lectures given en route to Hong Kong instructed the men how to load a rifle. And then she says, staring into the camera, "Honestly, it's just appalling," as she looks away in disgust. And then in the investigations that took place for the Valor and the Horror, which were quite well known, there's notes that Christie had mentioned that the men were just going for garrison duty, and that they were not going into an active combat zone. Also, how she could be crying about a soldier's fate before the fighting even took place makes no sense. They also get the only Victoria Cross winner of the battle, Company Sergeant Major John Osborne's exploits completely wrong. Dates are mixed up, events are conflated with other ones. It's just an interesting thing to note because McKenna, particularly Brian McKenna, was all about the individual low-level soldier, and to get such details wrong shows that that they were not doing proper research, despite their claims that all of this was true in their episode. They mentioned the attack on Stanley Village as a suicide attack, which it was not. They provide no context behind any of it. So towards the end of the 20th century, little had changed about how the Battle of Hong Kong was viewed, but changes were on the horizon. In 1993, a new group took up the mantle of the fighting for the Hong Kong veterans. The Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association, comprised mostly of the children of the members of C-Force, was started. The new organization stemmed from the concern that HKVA members were struggling to fulfill their mission given their advancing age and health problems. The HKVCA defined its purpose to educate Canadians on the role of Canada soldiers in the Battle of Hong Kong, and to focus on the interment of the battle survivors on both soldiers and families. And again, they were going to work to continue to still provide support to the veterans and their widows. So commemorative efforts of the HKVA started in the early 20th century. As you can see here, they ended up building a memorial wall that includes the names of all members of C-Force, the killed and those who survived. What is interesting about this story is they reached out to the National Capital Commission. For those of you who don't know, they are the ones who are in charge of the capital region where I live in Ottawa and make all the major decisions related to land use and everything along those lines. So they were given a small chunk of land, as you can see here, but no other help. Initially, the construction of the wall was delayed because the NCC said the design was not innovative enough and had to be improved. The original design more or less looks the same as the final. So again, this is just more seemingly stymieing and delaying by the Canadian government. And again, sorry, the wall was eventually completed in 2009 and then unveiled in August. So at the 15th August unveiling of the memorial wall in Ottawa, Philip Doddridge, then the president of the HKVA, remarked, "The ceremony today marks the fulfillment of a dream, a vision that started years ago when we began to realize that many of our comrades who have left this world would not be recognized for their valiant efforts of so many years ago." The memorial wall does just this. It allows a place for Hong Kong veterans to be remembered in a positive context. They're not presented as victims of imperial scheme or pawns in a political vendetta. Their service and sacrifice is now literally set in stone. Doddridge closed his speech with, "And so until this disown disintegrates and returns to dust, we will be remembered." So the Battle of Hong Kong's legacy is safe to say negative. As I've shown, the reputation's been built over decades. Again, not saying that there's not much bad about what happened. The reinforcement, of course, was a mistake, but we only know that in hindsight. The treatment of the POWs by the Japanese was cruel and must be remembered along the feats achieved by C4s in battle. The Canadian government of handling of Hong Kong veterans' issues has left a lot to be desired, but nothing can be done to help the veterans who have passed away. What can be done is remember what the Hong Kong veterans did. I'm not presenting this as a jingoistic call to arms, only talk about successes. I'm just asking for a little more nuance to enter the discussions. As an example, defeats are not only seen as bad in many other national contexts. In Australia, you have Anzac Day, which memorializes the defeat at Gallipoli. The charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava in 1854 is remembered through poetic verse. Even the defeat of the Spartans at Thermopylae is still revered around the world. The Battle of Hong Kong has nowhere close to any reputation like this. But I argue it's not too late to change the legacy. We can remember more than just the bad. The actions of those who fought at Hong Kong deserves to be remembered for more than their suffering and poor treatment. The stand at the Wong Ni Chong Gap and the attack on Stanley Village deserve to be remembered along other Canadian actions from the war. The Battle of Hong Kong is poorly remembered in Canada, but this need not be the case forever. We can still change how we think about this battle and those who fought for it, who fought in it for Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Fantastic. I think we were talking earlier, and I know a lot of the people I was speaking to before the talk today were saying that this is an area of Canadian history that is not well known. So thank you for bringing this to light to us, and also the re-examination as well.
Thanks for having me on and giving me the bigger platform to talk to people. It's very much appreciated.
Absolutely. So we have a number of questions now. A few of them relate back to sort of the events of the battle. So I'll start with just a couple of those, if that's all right, and then get into the legacy a little bit more. So the first one, in a general context, were the Allied troops, maybe the British, maybe the Canadian, before the battle, were they aware of the massive buildup of Japanese troops? Were they did they sort of know this was coming? Did they know they were massively outnumbered, or was it really more of a surprise?
They had no idea. Even the commanders had almost no idea of what was facing them literally across the border. There's numerous accounts of literally Maltby, Lawson going to the literal fence on the other side and saying, "Oh, there's only these weak Japanese troops who look disheveled across that." They expected only around 2,000 troops at the time of the attack, which of course, as we know now, was not the case. There was an intelligence, more or less, failure to track the Japanese divisions in that area. And they basically lost track of the 38th Division and its strength, which was augmented, right, with all those artillery units and the engineers and things like that. So the troops had no idea that there was that many troops on the other side of the border.
Interesting. And did that come up in the inquiry at all?
No. So the inquiry takes place in 1942, right? So no one who fought in the battle is present, right? You can't, it's impossible, right? So none of this comes up. That's why I mentioned the loading at Vancouver. It's inconsequential after the war, really, the loading about vehicles and all those things, but that is like 90% of the focus of the inquiry, which as I just said, doesn't really have an impact once the war is over, especially in lessons learned and things like that. Clearly, the Allies learned how to, take care of the logistics during the Second World War. So it's things like that you would expect to be discussed don't come up in the slightest.
Fascinating. And sort of bouncing off of that,
Yep.
is a wartime inquiry? Do these things happen? Like, this feels incredibly unusual to me, that a 1942 inquiry into.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it is. One of the reasons I forgot to mention, again, just lack of time and what I wanted to focus on, is there was an inquiry after Pearl Harbor, right? And that takes a lot, it stems a lot from that, trying to understand what happened. But again, Pearl Harbor is different, right, than Hong Kong. Those who survived Pearl Harbor are still serving at Pearl Harbor in many ways, right? So it's a little different in who they can talk to and what they can do, right? This is on foreign soil where the entire garrison is made POWs or killed. So it is very unusual in this sense, but also just to happen generally. But again, I think that speaks more about King and George Drew than it does about wartime secrecy or anything of that nature, because they're both trying to outdo each other again for the umpteenth time here. So I think that plays more into it than, say, wartime censorship, because I've seen not just Hong Kong, but in my work in other areas, the things you would expect to be censored in wartime are just out and about and in the open. So it's a really interesting kind of case study to look at in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Turning more to the memory, I wonder, perhaps this is a little bit beyond your scope, but I wonder if you can talk about the sort of Hong Kong and the British memory. I have a vision that it's a very similar to Canadian. I know some of us have knowledge of the Royal Scots through our reenactment organizations, and it's my understanding it's sort of considered a very dark day in British military history as well. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I mean, it changes and it has different changes. One I couldn't get into again because there's so much here and it's fascinating, right? That's why it's literally a dissertation. But anyway, sorry, yeah. So how do I say this? It was, right, because this is the first major colony to follow Britain's when the Japanese started what became known as basically the Southern Advance. Singapore, falls very soon after this. That dominates the narrative. So yes, the British memory is of a negative one, but in comparison to Singapore, right, this is a minnow next to a blue whale, more or less. But what is interesting about all of this is in the early 90s, in 93, after the race to the Valor and the Horror, the British government of the day was facing a lot of pressure from Australia and Canada to release some documents and some diaries about what happened. Maltby made a report after all of this, but the report the public saw had been censored or had been edited. The governments wanted the governments of Canada, and then there was one also for Australia, Singapore. They wanted these released, and the British government was tired of taking the flack, released them. And these two, especially in Maltby's, blames the Canadians for the fall. They blame them for everything that went wrong. So that is, in a way, that, not saying that that's a dominant narrative in Britain, but that got a lot of press coverage at the time, saying that these drunken colonials are the ones who caused the fall. It wasn't on us, it was on them. And that fits for both Australia at Singapore and for Canada at Hong Kong. And I think it's just kind of disappeared again because of Singapore, right? Singapore and the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse get a lot of attention. Hong Kong, it's a blip in a lot of ways, which I'm trying to change. But in Britain especially, I think it's very much out-remembered just because of the significance of Singapore.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it would be fabulous if you could bring that story to the British audience as well.
Mm-hmm.
A couple more quick questions. One is about sort of war crime trials.
Right.
Have you seen sort of the results of those after Hong Kong? Or any? Yeah,
there wasn't. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I'm thinking about shooting wounded after at the end of the battle. Were those sorts of things brought to justice, brought to light?
It depends, I guess, what your definition of justice is. A few of the commanders down at that regimental level that I talked about, right, were brought to justice, I guess you could say. They served quite short, sentences. Sorry, only a couple of years from what I remember off the top of my head. I looked at the files, but that was a very long time ago. Because actually, what most of the attention on is trying to find the bodies of those who were basically massacred and killed. That's what a lot of the attention was, and those commanders are actually quite helpful, I guess is the best word I can use, right? In that kind of search, that's what most of the time is spent doing, because A, to prove that it happened, right? But also because of everything that comes with commemoration and the policies under the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, wanting to bring those men to have a proper burial. And sorry, not just men, the Japanese killed civilians, men and women and children as well, the same as soldiers. So in my opinion, no, they were not brought to proper justice, other than, who I mentioned, Kamloops kid, Hanoi, who was hung, but he's the only one, as far as I know, who was executed because of Hong Kong. Because also I should have added too, sorry, this is a bit of an aside, but the 38th Division doesn't stop fighting in Hong Kong, right? They go on, they join the invasion force of the Netherlands East Indies and face a lot of heavy fighting there. But a good chunk of the division is also sent to Guadalcanal. And I'm sure a lot of people know what happens at Guadalcanal, right? With the battle with the 1st Marine Division later on, the division's more or less wiped out at Guadalcanal. So all of these commanders and survivors of the battle most of them were killed, and documents and everything were destroyed.
Right. And as a one final segue, are there Canadian veterans of the Battle of Hong Kong? Are there still survivors today?
Last I saw, there are 4 left alive who served in Sea Force. I'm not sure about the battle overall, how many are left. There are still some who live in Hong Kong still who are still alive. George McDonnell, I know, is still going, still sharp as a tack, smart man, and claims he's slowing down, but I don't believe it. I talked to him in August. He's still going strong. So I'm not sure, but that's the last I saw from the HKVCA. Just put out a report that there are 4 left alive. The last grenadier died a month ago. So yes, there are literally a handful left.
Well, that's great that you can you still have the opportunity to talk to these people. I know that's becoming very rare among Second World War historians.
Yeah, it's quite. I mean, it's just outright. It's quite sad, right? Because that's how time works. But it's that generation. They're leaving us in large numbers every day.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I'm in just a second. I'm going to turn it back over to Tom. But just before I do, I want to say thank you again. This was fantastic, as I say, eye-opening knowledge that is just a gap in a lot of Canadians' understanding of the Second World War. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
So can't let you go yet. I told Chris I had a couple questions myself. So
fire away.
But so help me with timelines. The Battle of Hong Kong was December 1941.
Right.
And then the inquiry kicked off, it was pretty early. Was it January of 1942?
The rumblings about doing one were almost immediate. The actual hearings are held they started in mid-March, take a couple of weeks. There's a few illnesses here and there, like George Drew becomes ill, so they can't finish, basically. So that's why it takes until June for the report to get released.
No, but it's just, I find the notion quite laughable. Like, given the distances, the lack of communication knowledge, like what on earth could they possibly find out or establish? Like, it's.
Well, yeah, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. And I hope to do, I had an article prepared that just didn't get accepted, unfortunately, about the inquiry, because you're not the first person to ask me that question. Trying to understand what it means, right? And why it develops the way it does, what that tells us about Canada at war, which I think is really interesting.
Well,
exactly right what you just said, right? It doesn't make any sense.
And then, but I got wondering as you were describing that. So I have a passing familiarity with World War II, but like back to timelines.
Yep.
But Hong Kong was the first appreciable fighting by Canada in the Second World War, wasn't it?
First, well, no. I think the aviators and the sailors would say no. The Royal Canadian Navy and the RCAF are involved in operations from the get-go, right? It's the
Okay,
Canadian Army battle.
so land forces.
Yes, the first land battle. It's the first exchange, and as they say, shots fired in anger with the enemy of the
Yeah, because Dieppe happened later in 42, and then the
Yeah, August.
Italian campaign doesn't go until 43, right?
Yeah, July 43. Yep.
Okay. No, I just wondered, did that draw extra attention to it? Like it was the first land exchange or land battle, and essentially it was a disaster. And then I guess the other thought I had, you know, Canada's war experience has largely been in a European theater. What was there
Exactly.
an underestimation of the Japanese, their fighting ability, the size and scale of their forces? Like, because it's really an unknown enemy for a lot of the European armies, right?
Well, that's yeah. You're paddling in some deeper waters there, Tom. Yeah, I mean, how do I say this? The Canadian appreciation of the situation is almost nil. It shouldn't have been. They were given almost all the intelligence that Britain had, except for the ultra, code decryptions, right? That everyone famously knows about now. Like that's the top level of secrecy, right? They were given everything else. Nobody read it. As far as I can tell, literally no one went through the files. So on the Canadian level, they should have known better that they didn't. That's another major part of my dissertation, is saying, I know you saw this or you had access to it, you did nothing with it. But then to go to your other point where I said it's deeper waters, is it's not just Canada, it's Britain, the United States, the Dutch government in exile. I mean, they're a small player here. Is completely underestimating the Japanese. They knew better. They knew what the Japanese were capable of. A lot of them had been watching the war in China for years, right, which starts in 1937 in a full blown out war. A lot of them had been watching it. But why that's important, why I bring that up, is they thought that it's pure racism. They thought that the Japanese were lesser than them, but that the Chinese were lesser than the Japanese. So the Japanese are beating this inferior enemy. What do we have to fear from them? And as they learn, right, in late 1941, there's a lot to be feared.
Yeah, and I have to admit that's probably the rapids I was steering towards, but we'll leave it off there. So
sorry, I mean, I know it can get people's backs up, but it's just I've seen the writings, I've seen the words used. It's just true, right down to the level of someone like Maltby, right up to the top levels. It's just the truth.
All right. Well, fascinating topic. I've learned a lot. I hope our audience did too. Really appreciate you sharing this, Brad. I know it's
Problem.
The area of your thesis or dissertation, and it's quite an area of interest for you, and it's nice to capture some of your passion. So thank you very much. Thank you to everyone that has joined us today, joined us every step along the way, and we look forward to having you be with us again in the new year as we kick this off, less than a month, in early January. We'll have the website updated and the new version of our website up and running within a few days, and registrations will open up. So thank